What we're going to need this morning, if you have it with you, will be your genealogy of the Herodian family, as well as the list I gave you not that long ago, a few messages ago, of the first century prefects. We'll need both of those to begin with. One of these is this sheet, the runoff sheet, genealogy of the Herodian family, and your list of first century prefects. We looked at almost 15 of these. Coponius was the first one, AD 6 to 7, that begins ruling after Archelaus is banished. And we really skipped over the first 4 of these because not a lot is known about them and there's not much important about them. We started with number 5, the best known of the prefects, Pontius Pilate. Then we skipped number 6 and number 7, very little known about them. And then notice you have a little gap between numbers 7 and 8. Maurilius rules from AD 39 to 41, and Cuspicius Fadus from AD 44 to 46. So I said put a little gap there, and we're asking ourselves now, this morning, the question, what's taking place during this period of time, from 41 to 44? You look on your list of first century prefects. Obviously you can see that we don't have a prefect in Palestine from 41 to 44. That is because the emperor appointed a king, reminiscent of Herod the Great, of course, and one who happens to be a descendant, a grandson of Herod the Great, and that's Agrippa I. So we're going to be looking primarily at his life this morning. And his full name is Herod Agrippa I. He's another Herod. He's another one in the Herodian line, but he's chiefly known by his title Agrippa. He is going to be the one ruling as king between numbers 7 and 8, Maurilius and Cuspicius Fadus, from 41 to 44. He rules a little longer than that, but he's really only king from 41 to 44. Okay, that's all we need that for right now. Now we need the genealogy of the Herodian family, and let's kind of look at his ancestry then. I said the last time we used this genealogy that Aristobulus really is the most important son of Herod's because of some of his descendants. Aristobulus, married to Berenice, way over on the far left-hand side of your chart. And then all of this segment on the bottom left-hand side, all of these various names, Herod, Aristobulus, Agrippa I, that's our Agrippa, Herodias, the brother and sister, and then from Agrippa I, you see another long list of people descended that are very, very important. The others, we don't trace them too far. We go a little bit like with, whenever Herod is married to the second Mariamne, the daughter of Simon, whom he elevated to high priest. And then they produce Herod Philip, and then he marries Herodias. That was the first husband of Herodias. And this is the Herodias descended from Aristobulus and Berenice. Then we draw Herodias, her line out, just to show that she produced this daughter Salome. Because Salome then ends up married to the next Philip. If you move down the chart, Herod married to Cleopatra of Jerusalem, and they produce Philip, and then Philip marries Salome, which had come through a brother, a half-brother of his, and a distant sister-in-law, I guess we could say. So, Agrippa I, if you don't have your chart, we'll try to summarize. Agrippa I is a son of Aristobulus and Berenice. The son of Aristobulus and Berenice. And he is the grandson of Herod the Great through Herod's favorite wife, the first Mariamne. So he comes through Herod's favorite wife. That's another reason why he's so important. Those who come through Herod's favorite wife were counted more important. Agrippa I, the son of Aristobulus and Berenice, the grandson of Herod the Great through his favorite and second wife, but first Mariamne wife. And he marries one Cypros, which is not that important at all. I just noted that on the chart because wherever I was copying this probably had that down. Okay, notice what that makes him. That makes him an immediate brother, not half or distant or anything, but an immediate brother to the Herodias of the Gospels, the Herodias of the John the Baptist accounts in the Gospels. So Agrippa I and Herodias are brother and sister then. Okay, Aristobulus. We'll go back to the father of Agrippa I. Aristobulus had been executed by the command of his father in 7 B.C. Remember, toward the end of Herod the Great's life, he has almost everyone executed. And one of those people happened to be one of his first children, one of his first sons, Aristobulus, who was killed by the command of his father in 7 B.C. Agrippa had just been born 4 years prior to this. He was 4 years old whenever his father was killed. He was born in 11 B.C. And he was named Agrippa. He was named after an advisor to Augustus Caesar, who was a personal friend of Aristobulus. So Aristobulus names his son after a personal friend, whose name was Agrippa. And this personal friend just happened to be an advisor to Augustus Caesar. And like so many of the other boys, whether sons or grandsons of Herod the Great, he was brought up in all of the luxury of the capital city of Rome. So there's an introduction just to the very early parts of his life. When he was born, some of his background, he's brought up in the luxury, the education of Rome. So he is a Roman by citizenship, a Roman by location, a Roman by outlook. Of course, he's descended through Herod from Antipater, so he goes back to an Edomite, an Idumean ancestry. But I mean, he's a Roman in all the practical senses of the term. Okay, let's look at some other later things about his life. Of course, he's going to figure into the New Testament account, and we'll work our way up toward that. Number one, because of bad financial dealings, he did not know how to manage his money and how to prosper in business very well independently. Because of some bad financial dealings, he had to leave Rome in AD 23. And he chose as his place of settlement his ancestral home, Idumea. Of all places, he heads to Idumea. Probably to get a little closer to his sister, Herodias, who, of course, shortly after this time, she's going to end up divorced from Herod Philip and married to Herod Antipas, and that's what the complaint of John the Baptist was all about. And of course, if he's up in Tiberias, and that means she, Herodias, with Herod Philip is up in Tiberias. And so for Agrippa I to move from Rome to Idumea at least gets him rather close to his sister, and they seem to have been very close in more ways than one. Whenever he moves, he contemplates suicide because of all of the bad affairs he has experienced in Rome. But his wife, Cypros, talks him out of it. He's pretty close to his wife, but he's probably even closer maybe to his sister. He is married by this time. Of course, he's over 30 by this time, so he should be married. He contemplates suicide, and his wife talks him out of it. Finally, he begins to have some contact with his sister. I'm going to start putting this map up here, and then we will start working on it in just a moment. Here's Tiberius. And here's Idumea. So he's down here in Idumea. Herod Antipas, remember his capital. He is the tetrarch of Galilee, which is all of this region up here in Perea. This is this little region right here, remember. And of course Galilee. So since he has his capital up in Tiberias, the southwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee, this is where his wife is, Herodias, and this is the sister of Agrippa. He gets in contact with his sister, and she helps him to obtain a pension, a Roman pension. He's really not old enough for one yet, but she helps him get one anyway, helps him get both a pension and a home that is paid for by the Roman government in Tiberias. So this puts him very, very close to his sister, but it also puts him close to his uncle or his brother-in-law, or we could say and his brother-in-law, because Herod Antipas, of course, would be both of these things to Agrippa I, both an uncle and a brother-in-law. He and his sister get along just fine. He and his uncle hyphen brother-in-law do not get along very well. He quarrels quite a bit with his uncle, and as a result, he's more or less compelled to leave, and he goes back to Rome in AD 36. And it's this move that really sets in motion the future events and the outcome of his life. Travels back to Rome because he cannot get along with his uncle, brother-in-law, Herod Antipas in Tiberias, and this is in AD 36. Okay, whenever he gets back, he begins pulling a few strings in Roman government, and he becomes a close friend to Gaius Caligula. Who, of course, is to be a future Roman emperor and Caesar. This time he is the son of the current emperor, who of course is Tiberius. Caligula is the son to the emperor Tiberius. Now Caligula and Agrippa I hit it all fairly well together. They become very close friends. They do a lot of sporting and a lot of hunting outings together. And so one day while the two were riding in a chariot, Caligula and Agrippa I, then Agrippa I just made the casual remark he wished Tiberius was dead so that Caligula could become the emperor. And of course probably what Agrippa is thinking is, I'm so close of a friend to Caligula, to Gaius Caligula, the son of the emperor Tiberius. If he becomes emperor, that probably means something for me, probably means he's going to move me up in Roman rank and Roman society. Well, we're not exactly for sure whether it's Caligula or whether it's some servant who Caligula obviously hears the remark, but one of these, either Caligula or a slave or a servant or the driver or whatever, overhears what is said, and someone reports it back to the emperor Tiberius. Okay, this makes Tiberius suspicious that maybe Agrippa I is going to try to assassinate him. And so, of course, the way he's going to thwart that is, rather than assassinate Agrippa I, he simply locks him up in prison. This all takes place in the end of AD 36. So here we've got these two young men, friends now at Caligula, and that's going to work to the advantage of Agrippa I. Caligula and Agrippa I. And Tiberius is not too up on Agrippa I because of this comment that's been made. However, that really doesn't matter, because in the next year, AD 37, Tiberius dies and Caligula comes to the throne and, of course, releases his friend Agrippa I from prison. And upon releasing him, then he sends him back to the Levant and confers upon him the tetrarchies of Philip and Lysanias. This is the Philip and Lysanias of Acts 3:1 fame. Okay, do you remember what the tetrarchies were of Philip and Lysanias? Let's start with the easiest one, the latter of those. What's the tetrarchy of Lysanias? Well, you may have to look it up. This area right here, I believe. The tetrarchy of Lysanias, the tetrarch. He gives him that. Well, I'm going to show you how slowly he just absorbs almost this whole territory here, which then makes him, in the extent of his rule and government, almost equal to his grandfather, Herod the Great. So it's no surprise that he does end up as king. So this is the tetrarchy of Lysanias of Luke 1. Then we have the tetrarchy of Philip. And we've got two different Philips. One who's involved in politics and one who just desires to be a private citizen. We've got this little region, Iturea. This is all that Luke gives us. Iturea and Trachonitis. Do those terms sound familiar? Trachonitis. And then we have other terms, other areas over here that he becomes the tetrarch over. Gaulonitis, Auronitis, and Botania. That's how much territory he takes over. The tetrarchies which had formerly belonged to Lysanias, Abilene, Abilene. He also takes over this larger tetrarchy of Herod Philip, Iturea, Trachonitis, Gaulonitis, Auronitis, Botania. All of this territory, of course, found just due east of the Sea of Galilee. All of this comes into his control in the year AD 37. Remember, we're still talking about this lapse in period between these prefects of the years 41 to 44. That's why I said earlier when I first started the message this morning that although those are his technical years, 41 to 44, those are his years for kingship. Those are not his years for ruling. He rules longer. He's not king, but he rules longer, and it goes back to as early as 37. So basically he rules from 37 to 44. He dies a very tragic, very sudden, very terrible death, and we'll look at that later on. It's mentioned in the Bible and in Josephus as well. So by the year 37, he's already controlling these two tetrarchies, which according to Luke 3:1 had formerly belonged to Lysanias and to Herod Philip in order. Okay, at the same time, AD 37, Herodias, by the way, and Herod Antipas are still here in Tiberias. The same year in 37, Herodias pushes her husband to travel to Rome and to request the title of king for all of his long and many years of hard work. Remember, he rules from 4 BC to AD 39. Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas, also the Herod of Luke 3:1. And I said this in the very end of the message on Herod Antipas. I said we'd come back to that. His wife is the one, Herodias, who more or less compels him to go to Rome and ask for the title of king. Well, whenever he goes back, remember that he has had, or maybe I should reverse it, Agrippa I, his nephew and his brother-in-law, has had quite a problem with him as far as quarrels and factions are concerned. And so Agrippa I is going to use this opportunity, this time whenever Herod Antipas is traveling back to Rome. He's going to use this opportunity to get back at his uncle for the fact that in AD 36, the quarrels that he had with his uncle more or less pushed him away from Tiberias and sent him back to Rome. So here's what happens. Remember that by now Agrippa I is on very, very good terms with Caligula, who is the new Roman emperor here. And I even said whenever I ended the Herod Antipas message that was one reason why Herod Antipas was not successful in his petition before the king, the emperor, before the new Caesar, to gain the territory that he desired, or to gain the official title of king. That's because we have a changing of the guard. We go from Tiberius to his son Caligula as the emperor of the Roman Empire. Whenever something like that happens, it's really not the time. It would appear to be, but it's really not the time because of the state of affairs, confusing state of affairs, to go and request some higher distinction or some higher title. So here's what Agrippa I does. Agrippa I is on good terms with Caligula, and he travels to Rome himself, and he reports to Caligula that his uncle, brother-in-law, Herod Antipas, has an arsenal at Tiberias that is of munitions that could equip 70,000 men, and has them stored in some secret hidden caves. This is all that Agrippa tells Caligula. Well, of course, by implication, what he means is, watch out, Caligula. Herod Antipas is thinking of overthrowing you, maybe going over on the side of the Parthians. This is exactly the implication that's intended, and it's precisely the implication that's picked up by Gaius Caligula. And as a result, here in AD 39, Herod Antipas is banished to Gaul. And a lot of this material we get from Josephus. This isn't New Testament or biblical material, but it does come from Josephus. So just to rehearse that story to make sure you have it, Agrippa I is trying to get back at Caligula. And so whenever Caligula, with the urging of his wife, goes to Rome to secure for himself the title of king, Agrippa goes along and reports bad rumors about him to Caligula to poison the mind of the emperor against him. And it works just according to plan. Remember, the Romans are against the Parthians at this time. The Parthians are in control of the territory just east of all of this Roman Empire. And so it looks very bad on the record of Herod Antipas, even to be thought of as having an arsenal. Why would you need an arsenal that would supply arms for 70,000 men unless you have some devious plan? It's not even certain that he had an arsenal. It's probably just a lie that Agrippa dreams up, but according to plan, it's believed by Caligula, and therefore he acts accordingly, which means that he would banish Herod Antipas. And Caligula at the same time offered to treat Herodias, and I think I said this at the end of that message as well. He offered to treat Herodias as the sister of Agrippa and not the wife of Antipas, if she so desired. She had her choice. In other words, if he kind of overlooks the fact that she's married to an enemy of his, Herod Antipas, what appears to be an enemy of his, Herod Antipas, because of this report that Agrippa has brought back, then it's not going to go so well for her. If he overlooks that and just treats her as what she really is, a sister to Herod Agrippa I, who is a friend of his at this time, then things will go well for her. So Caligula holds it out before her. Herodias, I will treat you either as A, the sister to Agrippa, or B, the wife of Antipas. If I treat you as A, the sister to Agrippa, then you'll be treated well. Whatever goes for Agrippa goes for you. If I treat you as B, the wife to who is now my enemy, Herod Antipas, it will really not go well for you. She chose B. She seemed to very much love her husband. This is her second husband, remember. She had divorced Herod Philip and had married Herod Antipas, and that's what John the Baptist was ranting and raving about all the time. It cost him his head. Literally, it cost him his head. But she chose to go with her husband into exile. She stayed with him evidently until the day of his death. Well, now, with Herod Antipas failing in his petition as king, he not only fails to go up a notch in title, just from being a tetrarch to king, but what he had to begin with is taken away from him. Galilee and Perea. And both of these, the tetrarchies that had formerly belonged to Herod Antipas, are now also given to Herod Agrippa. That means he controls what had belonged to Lysanias, what had belonged to Philip, and what had belonged to Antipas. Herod Antipas, remember, is the most important Herod of the gospel narratives. So he is given quite a lot of territory. And around the same time, of course, he is promised the kingship. He doesn't actually start working in that capacity until 2 years later. But by AD 39, he is controlling quite a bit of Palestine. Not down here in Samaria, not down here in Judea yet, but he's controlling quite a bit of territory. Okay, a side note that I decided not to say a whole lot about, as a matter of fact, nothing about, but to sum it up in a sentence, because it can be very technical, but just to let you know another little event that's taking place. Around this same time, AD 39, a lot of important things happened down in Egypt regarding the emperor's attitude toward the Jews in general, the attitude of Caligula. And things could go very badly for the Jews because of some of these events that take place. A lot of these are narrated in Josephus. I just don't think I'll get into that because they don't specifically concern any of these leaders that we are discussing. Whenever Herod Agrippa notices what's taking place down in Egypt, then as much as possible he attempts back in his own territories to divert serious consequences away from the Jews, and he is successful in Palestine, at least, in his attempts. So that's just a parenthetical statement of what's going on down in Egypt around this time. Okay, Caligula is assassinated now, and his uncle Claudius is elevated to emperor. The end of the 4th decade AD. And whenever he comes to the throne, he confirms the territory of Agrippa. Plus, he now gives him Samaria and Judea. Which then in the year AD 41 makes Herod Agrippa I, at least in the extent of his territory as well as his designation, almost equal to his so very, very famous grandfather, Herod the Great. Only one can be Herod the Great, but Herod Agrippa I would be, as far as the extent of the territory and the designation, he controls almost all of Palestine, he's designated as king, would have to be the second most outstanding of the Herodian leaders. Just for that reason. Now, for the reason of the New Testament, of course, Herod Antipas comes in as the most important because he's the Herod in Galilee throughout the life and ministry of Jesus. But as far as all of this territory is concerned, and that covers, well, just about everything that had been controlled by Herod the Great before, except their ancestral home, Idumea, down here. And he essentially controls that. You have the Nabateans who are pushing northwardly from the southern, the southwestern tip, the southeastern tip as well of the Dead Sea, but he's in control of so much territory it really doesn't matter. So he's controlling all of Palestine, all the way up to the north. He's controlling just a little bit east of the Dead Sea and of the Jordan River, Perea, and a little bit east of the Sea of Galilee with all of these various things, the Trachonitis, Gaulonitis, Auronitis, and Botania. So he's controlling just about the same territory that was controlled by his father Herod the Great. And he rules as king from AD 41 to AD 44. Okay, let's look at some points of his later life and bring ourselves to conclusion of a study of him then. He was much liked by the Jewish people. Herod the Great was not liked by the Jewish people. His grandson Herod Agrippa I was liked by the Jewish people because he was always doing things to appease them and to win them over. And they thought very, very highly of Agrippa I. Even the Pharisees liked him, which says a lot. For the Sadducees, that would be one thing, but they're more politically minded to begin with than the Pharisees. The Pharisees are more religiously minded. and to have them to come over on the side of A, an Idumean, an Edomite, and B, a Roman leader. And that's exactly what he is. He's a Roman king. Not just some little local tetrarch or ethnarch. He is a Roman king in this area. For the Pharisees to come over on his side and to be so favorable of him is to say a lot about him as far as his conciliatory work toward the Jews is concerned. Now, if he's come through Mariamne according to our genealogy, which he has, who was a granddaughter of Hyrcanus, as well as Aristobulus, through the mother and through the father of her, that means he has some Hasmonean blood in him. Remember, Agrippa I does have some Jewish Hasmonean descent. But it's just totally blown out of proportion by the Jews, to the neglect or to the suppression of his Edomite descent. He has Jewish blood because he has Hasmonean blood in him. Now Herod the Great doesn't have Jewish blood, but remember he marries a Hasmonean princess, Mariamne, his second wife, and the first of those two by that name. First of the two by that name. So that means that the descendants from the union of Herod and Mariamne, whether through Aristobulus, Alexander, or two of these others that we mentioned on the chart, that means they'll have Hasmonean blood. But it's just blown out of proportion. And of course it's blown out of proportion because the Jews want to see that side of him versus the Edomite, Idumean side of Herod Agrippa the first descent, because they're favorable toward him because of the things that he does in their favor. Now if you'll turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20, there is a story, a very interesting, rather amusing story, that's preserved in the Mishnah, M-I-S-H-N-A-H, that we've studied in biblical literature.
Now,
if you'll turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20, there is a story, a very interesting, rather amusing story, that's preserved in the Mishnah, M-I-S-H-N-A-H, that we've studied in biblical literature. There is a story preserved in the Mishnah that revolves around this kingly passage of Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20. Now, it had become law among the Jews that whenever a new king arose among the Jews, then it was his duty. This is not specifically said by Moses in this passage, but you could take it almost as an implication. It certainly would not harm anything. But it had become a law for the Jewish king to read at the Feast of Tabernacles these 7 verses from Deuteronomy 17, verse 14 through verse 20. Now come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, and shalt possess it, and shalt dwell therein, and shalt say, I will set a king over me, like as all the nations that are about me. Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. One from among thy brethren shalt thou set as king over you, and you may not set a stranger, which is not your brother. Well, see, Agrippa I kind of is a stranger. He definitely has Edomite descent. And he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he should multiply horses. For as much as the Lord hath said unto you, ye shall henceforth return no more that way. Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away, neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold. And it shall be, when he sitteth upon the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write him a copy of this law in a book, out of that which is before the priests, the Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read therein all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of this law and these statutes to do them, that his heart be not lifted up above his brethren, that he turn not aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, to the end that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children, in the midst of Israel. So on this certain Feast of Tabernacles, he stood up to read. And whenever he got to that 15th verse, that speaks of a prohibition against a foreigner, one who is not a brother, of being king. Whenever he got to this 15th verse and he began to weep, this is preserved for us in the Mishnah, and we don't really know whether it's true or not. He began to weep over his Edomite ancestry. I guess, kind of feeling sorry that he was an Edomite, and wishing so greatly that he were a Jew. And of course, that really appeals to the people. They think, look at this spiritual man, that he's trying to be so in tune with the very letter of the Mosaic law that prohibits a non-brother, a non-Israelite, a foreigner from being king. And, he shows his great concern over what he feels is a violation of this. And of course, that impresses the Jewish people. And according to the Mishnah, this quotation has been preserved. All the people begin to shout with one accord. They yell at Agrippa I, and they say this: "Be not dismayed, O King Agrippa. You are indeed our brother." Shows how much the Jewish people liked Agrippa I. And of course, I'm giving you this information because it will prove another point here in a moment. They said, "Be not dismayed, for you are indeed our brother." Okay, he only appears one place in the New Testament. Anyone know where that is? Acts where? What chapter? No. No, not 26. We're to another Agrippa there. That must be Agrippa II over there. We'll be to him later. Okay. What chapter is that? She's saying, is that the one eaten up with worms? That's the one. Chapter 12. Chapter 12. The whole chapter is about Herod Agrippa I. Here's our only information we have in the New Testament about him. We'll read a little of this, and I want to read some of what Josephus has to say. He fills in more of the details of this very true historical account. Now, if we know that he is king from 41 to 44, he stops being king in 44. Something must have happened. Well, obviously he dies at the end of this chapter. That's why it stops. So the beginning of the chapter probably dates to maybe 43 B.C. This is how, or 43 A.D. This is how we can date some of the things in the book of Acts. And the end of the chapter obviously is A.D. 44, because we know from history that's when he dies. Now, it's a little confusing how we're going to fit in, this is another side note, but the last 4 verses of the preceding chapter, verses 27 through 30. Whether this really comes before or comes after what we have here in Acts 12, that all depends on your view of the so-called book of Galatians visits to Jerusalem. Remember, Paul says that he didn't go up until he went up 3 years later, he went up 15 days in Galatians 1. He didn't see any of the apostles except the apostle Peter. And then in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 1, he said, and then 14 years later I went up by revelation. And then we know that Paul also is in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15 with the Council of Jerusalem. So is that Acts chapter 15, is that the same as the Galatians 1 visit or the Galatians 2 visit? Or are those visits, Galatians 1 and 2, the same visit? And if they are the same visit, are they the same visit as this Acts 11:30 and Acts 12, verses 24 and 25, or are those the same as the Acts chapter 15 visit? Very, very confusing. It all depends on what one's chronology is. So we won't get into that. We'll just stay with Acts 12. We do know that it dates 43 to 44 A.D. Now, about that time, Herod the king. Now, here's another Herod. Remember all the Herods back in the Gospel. Here's another Herod. And notice that Luke calls him the king. That's exactly what he is. He's not a tetrarch. He's not a tetrarch like so many of the other Herods. The Herod Philip was a tetrarch. The Herod Antipas was a tetrarch. Now, Herod the Great was the king. But after that time, we have no kings. We come up into the 1st century A.D., we had this whole list of 14 prefects. The prefects are the ones who are controlling Palestine from Caesarea. They're the ones who are controlling Jerusalem. If that's all you know and all you think, then Acts 12:1 could really throw a kink into your beliefs. Now, about that time, Herod the king. That's why I said, notice that pause between the years 41 and 44 A.D. There is no prefect in Judea and Palestine during this time. There's only a king. So Luke is very correct in what he calls Herod here. And if you want to make a little note to help you remember, this is Herod Agrippa I. The other Herod in the book of Acts is a descendant of his, and he will be Herod Agrippa II, which will make him a great-grandson of Herod the Great. Now, about that time, Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church, and he killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. So now you know something about this man that killed the apostle James. This is Herod Agrippa I. And notice what this next verse says. And because he saw it pleased the Jews. What's the one thing we've said about him? He was liked very much by the Jewish people. Why? He always did things to appease them and to make himself acceptable and presentable to them. And that's what cost James his life, and that's what almost cost the apostle Peter his life as well. So Luke he's a reliable historian again. He's right in tune with what we know to be the psychological makeup of this man, Herod Agrippa I. That's the one reason it seems like we're not even told in the first verse, you see, why he stretched forth his hand to vex certain of the church. And he killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. We're not really told that until verse 3. But probably he didn't do that, and then, I noticed this pleased the Jews. That probably was his suspicion all along. By the way, maybe I need to add this in here. Remember, the prefects have their headquarters up here at Caesarea on the Mediterranean. Herod Agrippa I, he's the only one of, I can't say prefects, he's not a prefect, but he's the only one in that line of those 14 men that I gave you, and he makes the 15th, who moves his capital down here to Jerusalem. So for 4 years now, the Roman capital, for 3 years, the Roman capital is moved from 41 to 44 A.D., is moved from Caesarea down here to Jerusalem. So he is in Jerusalem. That can be proven not only from Josephus, but later here in chapter 12, we see him going up to Caesarea. That means he wasn't there all the time. He stayed down in Jerusalem. Remember, the prefects stayed up here in Caesarea all the time because this was built by Herod the Great, and they came down to Jerusalem only during the festivals of the Jewish people. So it's probably, since he lives in Jerusalem, he can see, and we're a few years after the day of Pentecost, several years after that now, he can see the great antagonism that exists between this new religion in Jerusalem. He wasn't there, by the way, 41 to 44. He wasn't there whenever all this happened at Pentecost. We're 10 years after that time now. So we've had a lot of development there. And we know that the hostilities are growing and growing and growing. And finally, there's just a total break. Paul says, I'm not going to the Jews anymore. From henceforth, I go to the Gentiles. There in the 1st century, in early history of Christianity, we find a very total and very permanent break between the Gentile Christian church and the Jewish Christian church, and between the feelings that they have toward one another. So if we're removed by 10 to 15 years from the day of Pentecost, by the time we get over here to Herod Agrippa I, we know that we've had enough time for these hostilities to brew. And he's intelligent enough to recognize this new religion of these Christian people. They do not get, and he likes the Jews, you see, because the Jews like him. They do not get along with the Jewish people at all. And so one way to get my foot more in the door of the Jewish people is to persecute the enemies of the Jews, and that would be the Christians. So that's probably why we have what we have here in verse 1, and he stretches forth his hand to vex certain of the church. It's just that Luke doesn't give us a reason until he goes through the martyrdom of the Apostle James. Anyway, let's pick up with verse 3 again. Because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Of course, intending to execute him. And he probably would have taken another apostle after that. And it was, of course, the combination of some of these things that eventually just scattered the church totally away from Jerusalem, so that there was no church. And, of course, by AD 70, the whole city and nation falls, and the Christians basically have fled by that time. Well, they all have fled by that time. Many of them don't flee until AD 66, but they do flee over east of the Jordan River. And when he had apprehended him, he put him into prison, delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after the Passover to bring him forth to the people, to the Jewish people, and maybe mock him and execute him after that. Peter, therefore, was kept in prison. But prayer, this is probably AD 43, but prayer was made without ceasing of the church unto God for him. When Herod would have brought him forth, the same night Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and the keepers before the door kept the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord came upon him, and a light shined in the prison. And he smote Peter on the side, and raised him up, saying, Arise up quickly. And his chains fell off from his hands. And the angel said unto him, Gird thyself, and bind on thy sandals. And so he did. And he saith unto him, Cast thy garment about thee, and follow me. And so he went out and followed him, and knew not that it was true what was done to him by the angel, but he thought he saw a vision. When they were past the first and second ward, you see, we're in Jerusalem here, not in Caesarea. When they were past the first and second ward, they came unto the iron gate that leadeth unto the city, which opened to them of his own accord. And they went out and passed on through one street, and forthwith the angel departed from him. And when Peter was come to himself, he said, Now I know of a surety that the Lord hath sent his angel, and hath delivered me out of the hand of Herod, and from all the expectation of the people of the Jews. Kind of be a retrial of Christ, a mocking of the Apostle Peter. He's the chief apostle in the group. Paul hasn't risen to prominence yet. He doesn't really do that until he starts taking off in the next chapter, in chapter 13, and then end up executing Peter as well. And when he had considered the thing, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. And as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a damsel came to hearken, named Rhoda. And when she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for joy, but ran in and told how Peter stood before the gate. They said unto her, Thou art mad. But she constantly affirmed that it was even so. Then said they, It is his angel. But Peter continued knocking, and when they had opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. But he, beckoning unto them with the hand to hold their peace, declared unto them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he said, Go show these things unto James. Now, not the dead James, but the living James, the Lord's brother, and not one of the sons of Zebedee. And to the brethren, and he departed and went into another place. Now, as soon as it was day, there was no small stir among the soldiers what was become of Peter. By the way, where was Peter locked up this whole time? Antonia. He was locked up in the fortress of Antonia. Where is Antonia in relation to the city? Remember the diagrams you've seen before? Close to the temple, which direction? North? What about due north or east or west? Let's just give ourselves and pretend like this is the city. Then where can we start? I don't want to start with traditional Gordon's Calvary and all this. We've got our 3 towers right here, Fazio, Mariamne. We have Herod the Great old palace here. We have Herod Antipas' palace here. This is the lower city that was called Ophel in the Old Testament, or Hill, the lower city of David. This is where most of the people lived in little houses down here. And here is the Temple Mount. And over here you have Wilson's and Robinson's Arch and Stairway. Here you have Pool of Bethesda. Hezekiah's Tunnel, ran down here. The Pool of Siloam down there. Here's the temple itself, faces toward the east. This is the door. This is Mount of Olives over here. How about northwest? The northwest corner of the temple precinct is Antonia. And we don't, House of Caiaphas may be up here somewhere. You just see all different types of things. You know, remember whenever we were looking at Pontius Pilate, we saw the various aspects of his trial, one before Annas, then before Caiaphas. This is during the night. Then one at the break of day. Then they take him to Herod, or to Pontius Pilate. Well, where is Pontius Pilate? We don't know if he has his garrison here at the fortress of Antonia, or if he's down here at the old palace of Herod the Great, which he had built and where he had formerly lived. The same is true with Caiaphas. Do we have Last Supper over here, or do we have Last Supper up here? You see both of those on maps. Does Caiaphas live up here? Where does Annas live? Do Caiaphas and Annas live together? Anyway, it's interesting to think of all these things because you think, okay, Peter is here in Antonia, and where would that put Agrippa? Well, it all depends on where Agrippa lives. Does Agrippa live here in the fortress? He's got a whole cohort of soldiers here, 600 men stationed here. Does he live down here? This was the old palace here of Herod Antipas. Did he take over the palace of Herod Antipas since he takes over his territory in AD 39 of Galilee and Perea? It's hard to say. But anyway, this is where Peter is, right beside the temple. And then we want to know, where does Mary live? You know, where do Mary and John Mark live? Well, they live somewhere here in the city. This is all walking distance, you know. We read about Peter going through a gate. Well, what type of gate are we talking about? It talks about the gate that leads unto the city. Well, there's so many gates around Jerusalem, and there are gates inside the city. Many people think that this is where the common people live, and all these little houses down here. This is Mount Zion over here. This area here is Mount Zion. This kind of slopes down into a valley. People suggest maybe that's where Mary and John Mark lived. Anyway, now as soon as it was day, verse 18, there was no small stir among the soldiers. This would be part of the cohort stationed at Antonia. What was become of Peter? And when Herod had sought for them and found him not, he examined the keepers and commanded that they should be put to death. Acts 12:19. Now remember, the apostles had earlier escaped by the intervention of an angel in chapter 5. And the leaders there do not put the people to death. But here the soldiers are put to death because they allow Peter to escape. Now here's a very important little notice that you generally just skip over because it's so historical, and that's the last part of verse 19. And Herod Agrippa I went down from Judea to Caesarea and there abode. It doesn't mean that he's going to stay there very long, but there he's abiding temporarily. Okay, that means that his home base is back in Judea and not in Caesarea. And remember, that just reverses everything that we've already studied and said about the Roman prefects. They would go from Caesarea up to Jerusalem and there abide for a while. So that end of that verse is very important, and it's true. Luke is true to historicity here and to the historical account. Okay, let's look at verses 20 through 23. Give us the end of Herod Agrippa I's life. Herod was highly displeased with them of Tyre and Sidon, but they came with one accord to him, and having made Blastus, the king's chamberlain, their friend, desired peace because their country was nourished by the kings. Well, I erased my map. I got to put my other map back up here. I forgot all about that. Now, we don't know. This is one of those verses that we don't know a lot about. There's no doubt about the fact that Luke is telling the truth here, but Josephus gives more information as to what caused Herod Agrippa I to actually leave Jerusalem and go up here to Caesarea. The people of Tyre and Sidon take that occasion and use it to their advantage, but they're not the ones that brought him up there. According to Josephus, what I'll read here in a moment, he goes up there to celebrate a festival in honor of Caesar. Okay, let's put Tyre and Sidon up here. They're part of Phoenicia. And here's Caesarea. And here's Jerusalem. He goes up here to Caesarea. And people come down from Tyre and Sidon. And we're told that he was highly displeased with them. Remember what territory he controls now. Phoenicia, if we've got Mount Carmel right here, then Phoenicia is his territory as it goes up. He's controlling everything throughout this whole region here. He doesn't control Phoenicia, not as such. He is not king as such over this. It says that he is highly displeased with them. Why? We simply don't know why he was displeased with them. But they've got some type of political faction between he and the people. They came with one accord to him, and the way they reach the king is to reach one of the members of his court, one man, Blastus, the king's chamberlain, who they make their friend, and they reach Herod Agrippa through this member of his court, and desired peace because their country was nourished by the king's country. I don't want to get into all of that because that's just a study of the book of Acts, but you've got to remember that it's all in this area right here, that we have the most fertile plains that Israel has. We have the valley of Megiddo. We call it Megiddo, Armageddon, but Armageddon, Megiddo, Esdraelon, various other valleys that we have here. Beautiful, beautiful plains that just stretch as far as the eye can see. Why I'm saying that is that's where most of Israel's crops were grown. And we're told here their country was nourished by the kings. Well, it may be stretching it, but some people have said maybe they were dependent, just like Rome was dependent upon Egypt as its breadbasket, as its granary. Maybe the inhabitants of Tyre and Zidon who live on this coast, and you got the anti-Lebanon mountain range that runs right behind them. You don't have a lot of territory to grow crops right here. Maybe they are dependent, agriculturally speaking, on the territory of Herod Agrippa I, and maybe that's why they want to be friends. Be that as it may, upon a set day, and I'll read in Josephus here in a moment, he'll tell us what that set day was. Upon a set day, Herod, arrayed in royal apparel, and this royal apparel is described by Josephus as being a silver garment, a garment made out of silver that was as brilliant as the sun. And it very much impressed the people. Sat upon his throne and made an oration unto them. And the people gave a shout, saying, "It is the voice of a God and not of a man." Okay, before we read on, this is Antiquities 19:8-2. Antiquities 19:8-2. Okay, just relax and listen to this. Is rather long. I don't know if I'll read all of it, but I will get started. Now, when Agrippa had reigned 3 years over all Judea, okay, he starts reigning over Judea in 41. So 3 years, if you count the 2 end years inclusive, 41 and 43, and count 42 in between, that makes this 43. If you skip the first year or skip the last year, you know, it just depends on how you reckon, how you count things. And you count 42, 43, 44, or 41, 42, 43, and don't count the last, you can end up either way you go with either 43 or 44 AD. We're saying 44. After he had reigned 3 years over all Judea, he came to the city of Caesarea, which was formerly called Strato's Tower. I don't know if I ever gave that to you, but this was a place before it was ever refortified and rebuilt by Herod the Great. Caesarea was known as Strato's Tower. Stratos, Strato's Tower. And there he exhibited shows in honor of Caesar. That's why it says he abode there. He didn't go for just one day. He went there probably for several days or for a few weeks. It's kind of some games and some shows that he puts on in favor of Caesar. Upon his being informed that there was a certain festival celebrated to make vows for his safety, at which festival a great multitude was gotten together of the principal persons, and such as were of dignity through his province. On the second day, of which shows he put on a garment made wholly of silver, arrayed in royal apparel, Luke says, a garment made wholly of silver, and of a contexture truly wonderful, and came into the theater. Remember the theater that was built there. We even saw that theater that still exists today. The theater early in the morning, at which time the silver of his garment, being illuminated by the fresh reflection of the sun's rays upon it, shone out after a surprising manner. and was so resplendent as to spread a horror over those that looked intently upon him. Presently his flatterers cried out, one from one place and another from another, that he was a god. Exactly what Luke tells us here. Luke's not borrowing from Josephus, and neither is Josephus borrowing from Luke. And they added, Be thou merciful to us, for although we have hitherto reverenced thee only as a man, yet shall we henceforth own thee as superior to mortal nature. They give the shout that he's a god. Exactly what Luke tells us. Now, we're not told anything about this Tyre and Zidon and Blastus business. Luke gives us that first, but there's a big distinction between verses 20 and 21. By verse 21, upon a set day, we enter into the narrative of Josephus, and this set day, of course, is this festival concerning Caesar. And let's go back to Luke's account, and what does Luke tell us? Immediately an angel of the Lord smote him, because he gave not God the glory. You see, Luke's more reliable than Josephus. He can correctly and theologically interpret things, give us the reasons why. And he was eaten of worms and gave up the spirit. He had some grievous disease. Remember how his grandfather, Herod the Great, died of something very, very similar. See what Josephus says. Upon this the king did neither rebuke them nor reject their impious flattery. But as he presently afterwards looked up, he saw an owl sitting on a certain rope over his head. And immediately understood that this bird, was an evil omen, a messenger of ill tidings, as it had once been the messenger of good tidings to him, and he fell into the deepest sorrow. A severe pain also arose in his belly, and it began in a most violent manner. He therefore looked upon his friends and said, I, whom you call a god, am commanded presently to depart this life. While providence thus reproves the lying words you just now said to me, and I, who was by you called immortal, am immediately to be hurried away by death. But I am bound to accept of what providence allots as it pleases God, for we have by no means lived ill, but in a splendid and happy manner. We don't know how much of this, is true. We just know the bare outline of this is most definitely true. And when he had said this, his pain became violent. Accordingly, he was carried into the palace, and the rumor, Herod's palace, so he's going to die up here in Caesarea then. The rumor went abroad everywhere that he would certainly die in a little time, but the multitude presently sat in sackcloth with their wives and children after the law of their country, the Jews, because they love him, remember, and besought God for the king's recovery. All places were also full of mourning and lamentation. Now the king rested in a high chamber, and as he saw them below lying prostrate on the ground, he could not himself forbear weeping. And when he had been quite worn out by this pain in his belly for 5 days, he departed this life, being in the 54th year of his age, the 7th year of his reign, for he reigned 4 years under Gaius Caesar, 3 of whom, so forth, over Philip's tetrarchy, and so forth. So he fills in a little more of the information, the specific occasion of the so-called Lucan set day of Acts 12:21, and how long he suffered this pain for 5 days. That's probably reliable. Luke doesn't tell us that. We almost could pick up the implication that he died immediately, that he was smitten of God, he was eaten of worms, and he gave up the spirit. But of course Luke doesn't say that. And if we take Josephus' account and his narrative to be reliable and to be valid, then he suffered for 5 days and then the man died. Okay, I had a little more information, but not on Herod Agrippa. I was going to move into someone else. I'll just end with saying this, that Herod Agrippa's son was too young to take over the rule of the country. He's only 17. Therefore, the emperor in Rome decides to revert to the system of the prefect.